Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting and to another collection of horrible fates. The final story in today's video is about an incredibly gruesome event, and despite plenty of written records about what happened, it still remains a mystery to this day. And although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. As I've mentioned on the channel before, a ton of research, writing, and work goes into creating videos, and I've previously shown what a powerful tool Opera is in helping with all of that. Well, Opera is back with an incredible update to their already awesome browser. Like for example, with their new update, their music player can now be detached to become a floating player for wherever you find it to be most convenient. Next, if you're the type of person who likes to customize every aspect of your experience, Opera's new Themes feature gives you full control over the animated background, the interface color, the intensity, and even the sounds the browser makes, like the ones you're hearing now. There's also their intuitive split screen, which is a must if you're jumping back and forth between two pages. Just drag the tab down and you can work on two things at once in the same window. And then if you're using more than two tabs, their Tab Island feature is essential. First, it automatically groups all the links you click on a web page that opens other windows, like Airbnb for example. Or if you want to sort your tabs by a certain theme or topic, you can create your own tab island and then just expand or collapse them whenever you want. The Tab Traces feature also marks your most recently visited tabs with an underline. The darker the line, the more recent it is, helping you easily identify and go back to pages you need without clicking around a bunch. And finally, their integrated AI Aria can now be opened in the command line using Control/ or Command/ if you're on a Mac, and this is all on the same page you're using, so you don't have to leave the page at all. They've also added both an image generation and image recognition feature. Like for example, it was able to correctly identify what mountain this is, which for the videos on the channel is quite useful. And although we use AI images sparingly, something that is extremely useful is generating a silhouette like this to then compose an entire scene in Photoshop. So, if you want to try out all these incredible features and streamline your workflow, I highly recommend you check out Opera for free using the link in the description below. And a huge thank you to Opera for sponsoring this video. Located 10 kilometers west of Silkeborg, Denmark, the Bjeld Bog is a wide open expanse of soggy, waterlogged ground that literally moves like a waterbed when stepped on. There are only a few trees dotting the area, and often a thick fog looms over parts of it. The bog is also desolate and hauntingly quiet. One look at it and you might assume that it would be a great place to hide a body, and the thing is, you'd be right. On the morning of May 6, 1950, two brothers and their mother were visiting the bog to dig up peat, which can be used as fuel for heating. While the two boys were shoveling in a fairly deep hole, their mother noticed something odd. She stopped the boys and pointed out something in the mucky ground, almost like some kind of protrusion. The boys didn't see anything and basically brushed their mother off, so she rolled up her sleeves, jumped into the hole, and started digging with her bare hands. It wasn't long before she felt exactly what it was that she spotted from the surface, and she didn't even need to see it to know what it was. With her hands beneath the muck, she could feel the unmistakable shape of a human head. It would be another 2 days before police were alerted to the find, and local authorities were actually working on a missing persons case of a young schoolboy and assumed that the boy's body had been found in the bog. This would quickly change though after arriving at the scene and seeing that the body was at the bottom of a hole more than 6 feet or 2 meters deep. The family told police that there were no signs at all that anyone else had been digging in the area when they arrived, which ruled out the possibility that the body was that of the missing boy. For a body to be that far buried, it had to be old. The local museum was then notified of the find, and several personnel arrived at the scene to examine the body. What they would end up seeing when they got there made it completely understandable why someone might think the body belonged to someone who had died more recently. The body was lying on its side in the fetal position, and the features on the face were still of such high quality that it expressed a sense of serenity and peace. The eyes and mouth were also closed, and in any other set of circumstances, you might assume the man was just sleeping. His head was covered in a leather cap with a chin strap, and what little hair they could see was red, indicating he had been there long enough for the substance in the water to die. What was impossible to ignore, however, was the rope made of animal leather that was still tied tightly around his neck. Experts from the museum knew pretty early on that this was a significant historical find, and soon after, the arduous task of recovering the body without disturbing it began. The two sons, museum personnel, and even some police officers began the very careful process of further excavating the body, which was dubbed the Tollund Man, named for the nearby village of Tollund. It was then taken to a hospital in Copenhagen so a forensics examiner could perform an autopsy. And while the age of the body was not yet known, it was clear that the Tollund Man's life took place long ago. After the mud and peat had been cleared away, the forensic examiner was stunned by just how well the body was preserved. The right side of the body, which was the side the man was laying on, showed very little sign of decomposition. Over time, it appeared as though the body itself had shrunk and there was some damage to the Tollund Man's arms and hands because of the digging, but all in all, the body was in shockingly good shape. The forensics examiner credited this to the bog itself. A bog environment contains very few minerals and even less oxygen. They also contain a lot of a particular acid. All of these factors come together to create an environment that's mostly devoid of bacteria that cause decomposition. The acid will, however, draw out calcium from the bones, which causes them to degrade and gives the body an almost jelly-like feel and appearance. Now, on initial examination, one of the first things the forensic examiner wanted to determine was the cause of death. Obviously, the noose that was tied around the man's neck was a pretty good indication, and subsequent examinations of the body would confirm that his tongue was also found to be distended, which is a hallmark of a death like his. So after that, the question then became why? To answer that question, it was important to peg down the age of the man, and not necessarily how old he was when he died, which is estimated to be between the ages of 30 and 40, but when he lived. This was left to carbon dating, and when the results of the test were in, they were astonishing. The Tollund Man was somewhere between 2200 and 2400 years old, meaning he lived during the early part of the Iron Age, well before the Romans conquered much of northern Europe. This means estimates of his birth year are between 405 and 380 BCE. During this time period, this area of Denmark was densely populated with farms surrounded by houses and villages. And while not much is known about the people of this time because they had no written language, evidence suggests that they performed religious rituals, likely as an offering to influence the god or gods they believed provided bountiful growth periods and harvests. And these rites likely included human sacrifice. And although he's the best preserved and most well known, the Tollund Man is hardly the first or only prehistoric body found in bogs of northern Europe. While these bog bodies, as they've been called, have been discovered all over places like Germany, England, Ireland, and the Netherlands, Denmark has actually uncovered more than 500 of them with skeletal remains dating back to the Iron Age or beyond. And one thing many of these recovered bodies have in common is that their end was violent and intentional. Some have been found to have been stabbed, bashed in the head, and of course, others similar to the Tollund Man. And the reason so many of these people have been found is that modern-day researchers believe that these bogs were viewed by the people of the period as supernatural sites. Because many places like Denmark at the time were covered in thick, dense forests, bogs were a bit of an anomaly because they were mostly treeless, leaving nothing but clouds between the ground and the blue sky above, almost giving people direct access to the heavens. In addition, there appears to have been great care taken in burying the Tollund Man despite the noose around his neck. Forensics determined that his eyes and mouth had been closed for him after death, and his lying position as if sleeping suggested that he was intended to be laid to rest in a peaceful manner, which would be consistent with how human sacrifice was handled at the time. So, in the end, experts seem to be in agreement that the Tollund Man, for whatever reason, was chosen and killed as sacrifice. In the nearly 75 years since the body was recovered, it's continued to undergo extensive testing, and today, the well-preserved head of the Tollund Man is on display at the Silkeborg Museum. The latter half of the 19th century was a time of great growth and expansion for the City of London, and it was a transformative period for the world's largest city in a number of ways. Its population boomed and industry cropped up everywhere, helping London become a hub of international finance and trade. And as it grew, so did the city's many boroughs, and each of those boroughs seemed to define itself in one way or another from a socio-economic standpoint. Anywhere you went in the city at the time, you might stand on a street corner and see incredible Victorian mansions on one side and overcrowded slums on the other. And such was the case in the South London borough of Southwark in 1885. Known as an area rife with crime and poverty, Southwark didn't exactly have the best reputation. Conditions for many residing in the borough were barely livable, with some families crammed into single-room homes if they were lucky enough to have a home at all. The area was also overcrowded and surrounded by disgusting waterways that were used for everything from bathing to cooking to drinking. But while you might have had to look hard to see them, there were some bright spots in Southwark. Union Street in particular was dotted with stores and shops owned by families who would have been considered middle class, yet still weren't living with very many luxuries. The Chandler family was a perfect example of this dynamic in 1885. Henry, the 36-year-old man of the house, owned an oil and paint store at the corner of Gravel Lane and Union Street. Just upstairs was where the family lived, including his wife, Marianne, and 4 children between the ages of 3 and 7. Marianne's younger sister, Alice Ayers, also lived with the family as a nursemaid hired to take care of the children as Henry and Marianne focused on growing and maintaining their business. And even though she was paid for the work, it was a job the 26-year-old likely would have done for free. Alice was the 7th born of 10 children and was as gentle a woman as anyone was likely to find in London and hopelessly devoted to her nephew and 3 nieces. She was kind and soft-spoken, and her work kept her busy. At any given time on any given day, Alice would have a mental list of all the things she wanted to take care of for her sister's family before she would even think about anything for herself. Around midnight on Friday, April 24th, the Chandler home was finally silent and dark for the night with the children bedded down. The humble home had just 2 bedrooms with Henry, Mary Ann, and their son Henry in one room and Alice with her 3 nieces, Edith, Ellen, and Elizabeth in the other. However, just 2 hours later, the building would be the site of unimaginable devastation that started with just a few flames on the outside of the oil and paint shop on the 4th floor. A passerby then noticed the fire and began shouting up and down the street. At any time of day or night, the streets were usually populated in some way, and the man's shouting caused a crowd to gather quickly around the shop. As more and more people gathered around the building, the fire grew with alarming intensity, and the inside of the shop was like a feast for the fire, with cans of paint, casks of oil, and even kegs of gunpowder stored almost floor to ceiling. So within moments of the fire being noticed, the first floor of 191 Union Street was an inferno. Just a few blocks from the shop was the fire station at Blackfriars Road, which had a portable fire escape that was kept ready at all times. Several people in the crowd around the fire then sprinted down to the station to raise the alarm, and with all possible haste, the firefighters there rushed to the storefront. As that was going on, the crowd that had gathered noticed a figure in the second-story window. It was Alice in her nightdress. She then threw open the window and started calling for help, but at that point, everything that could be done was underway. The fire was much too intense for anyone under-equipped to try to enter the store, so the best that Alice and the family could hope for was the firemen hurrying to the scene with the fire escape. This didn't keep some in the crowd from trying what they could to save those trapped inside, however, and women started taking off their shawls and men removed their jackets so they could be tied up into a makeshift life net. When it was finished, there were more than a dozen people holding it out and yelling for Alice to jump in. In response, Alice stood at the windowsill and looked down at the life net for a moment before she turned back into the room, stunning all the onlookers. A moment later, the crowd saw a featherbed mattress starting to protrude out the window before it fell to the pavement below. Members of the crowd then cheered while others rushed over and picked it up before positioning themselves under the window, expecting Alice would soon make her leap. Once again, however, she disappeared into the thick smoke that was engulfing the bedroom before returning to the window. This time, there were 3 little figures with her. As the flames were coming from the outside of the second-floor window just above her head, Alice picked up 5-year-old Edith and held her out the window before gently letting her go. Edith then dropped right into the center of the mattress and was quickly gathered up and led away by those on the street. Next, Alice picked up 4-year-old Ellen, who was visibly and understandably terrified by what was happening around her. She clung hard to Alice and refused to let Alice hold her out the window, but as lovingly as possible under the circumstances, Alice threw the little girl from her arms. Ellen was then caught by a member of the crowd, and like her sister, she was ushered to safety. After Alice disappeared again and reemerged with 3-year-old Elizabeth, it was clear to the crowd that she was starting to struggle with the heat and smoke. It looked as if Alice might pass out and fall from the window, but in her dazed state, she managed to pick Elizabeth up and clumsily dropped her onto the mattress. At this point, the entire building was rapidly being consumed by the flames and time was running out, and those on the street cried for Alice to jump and save herself. However, clearly fighting to stay unconscious, Alice turned around once again, only this time she didn't disappear from the window. She instead turned back to face the crowd with a look of absolute terror on her face from whatever she was witnessing inside the home. Alice then went to step out the window, but in her weakened state, she vastly misjudged the leap. She then tumbled out the window, striking the upper part of the storefront on her way down and landing with a hard thud on the pavement below. Members of the crowd rushed to her, but Alice was knocked out and in terrible shape. They then loaded her up into a cab, which raced her to the hospital. By then, firefighters from several stations were at the scene with 20 engines parked outside the shop, spraying streams of water into the building, but it was too late. The fire was still too intense for firefighters to safely enter and look to save anyone else. It would take hours for them to get the fire under control to the point where anyone can go inside. As the remains of the building smoldered, the first firefighters entered and it became instantly clear that the fire quickly engulfed the downstairs shop, trapping those upstairs inside. The firemen then went up the steps to the second floor and there they found Henry. His body was badly charred and his arms were clutching a cash box. When he awoke to the fire, it appeared that he made his way into the shop to save the money before trying to retreat to the upstairs. Unfortunately, he was overcome by the smoke before he made it. After going past his body, just in the doorway of Alice's bedroom, firefighters located the bodies of Mary Ann and 7-year-old Henry Jr. This discovery would also connect some horrifying dots. When Alice turned back around for the last time, she likely saw her sister and nephew consumed by the flames, which prompted the look of blood-chilling terror she gave to those waiting for her to jump. As the sun rose on April 25th, word of the tragedy spread around London, and the public took a keen interest in the story of the nursemaid who selflessly saved her nieces, much to her own peril. There was so much interest in Alice that the hospital would provide newspaper reporters with hourly bulletins on her condition. In fact, even Queen Victoria sent a representative to the hospital to provide the monarchy with updates on Alice. The prognosis, however, was not a good one. In addition to being badly burned, Alice's impact with the pavement had caused a devastating spinal injury, and she was in and out of consciousness. Then, later that same morning, Elizabeth, the youngest and the last of the children to be tossed out the window, would sadly succumb to her burns and die. And the next morning, Alice would take her last breath too. According to some reports, Alice's final words were, "I tried my best and could try no more." In response, front pages of newspapers were splashed with the tragic news that sent the city into mourning. Days later, a memorial service for Alice was heavily attended to the point where mourners were turned away. Apparently, more than 10,000 people showed up to her funeral, and 16 firefighters carried her casket from her parents' home to the cemetery where she's now buried. Some months after her death, a publicly funded monument was constructed at Alice's gravesite, and a memorial tablet recognizing her was added to London's Memorial of Heroic Self-Sacrifice in 1902. And almost 140 years later, she's still remembered as a hero for her actions during the fire, which went from a few flames to consuming the entire building in less than 5 minutes. To this day, the cause of the fire that night in 1885 remains unknown. The Hebrides are a chain of islands off Scotland's western coast that have dramatic cliffs, rolling hills, and an often unforgiving climate. One cluster of these islands is aptly known as the Scottish Small Isles, where the island of Eigg is located. Eigg is the second largest of the Scottish Small Isles at just 9 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, yet for such a small area of land, it has a fairly extensive history. The island is actually dotted with important archaeological sites from prehistory, and the earliest known writings that reference the island date back to the 7th century. Axes found on the island suggest that it was even occupied during the Bronze Age as far as 3300 BCE. Some of the island's most notable history also includes the 9th century arrival of the Norse, who settled in the area and established the Kingdom of the Isles across the lands of the Hebrides archipelago. For hundreds of years afterward, the Vikings dominated the area, but by the middle of the 12th century, the Norse had been driven out and the region was controlled by Scottish clans. The Scottish clans are often thought of as related families, but in actuality, they operated more like tribal communities. Clans tended to have their own chief, and while those within the clan would often take the chief's surname, this didn't necessarily imply any sort of blood relation. And the oldest, largest, and most powerful of all the Scottish clans, Clan MacDonald, ruled the West Highlands and Hebrides for almost 400 years, but it wasn't without challenge. Due to a series of battles and losses, the clan weakened and fractured into smaller separate groups. By 1577, though, the clan made up the entire population of Eigg. Today, the island's population sits at just more than 100 people, but in the late 16th century, nearly 400 members of Clan MacDonald inhabited Eigg. This branch of the clan lived a modest but sustainable life through fishing and farming, but the occasional raid of other clan territories for resources wasn't beneath them. And so for generations, there was tension between Clan MacDonald and another prominent clan, the MacLeods. This clan was centralized to the north of Eigg on the island of Skye, and they weren't all that different from Clan MacDonald, yet their similarities weren't enough to overcome territorial disputes, competition for resources, and real and perceived slights. These factors would sometimes lead to physical conflict between the two clans, but what happened in 1577 was far more cruel and deadly than just their usual skirmishes. During a storm one day that year, a group of about 30 MacLeod members were sailing along the coast of one of the islands when a bad storm blew in. The clan did all it could to weather the barrage of rain and wind, but rather quickly decided that the best course of action would be to find land and wait it out. The closest and most feasible point to land just happened to be along the southern coast of Eigg, and so the Clan MacLeod men made themselves comfortable. After the storm finally blew out, they ran into a herd of cattle belonging to Clan MacDonald, and they took it upon themselves to kill and roast some of them to feed themselves. And as if this wasn't already a grave enough disrespect, there were some young MacDonald women tending to cattle who were attacked and assaulted by some of the MacLeod men. This was unforgivable. The clans of the Highlands upheld a strict code of honor, and any affront to their women was seen as an attack on the clan's dignity. So after the women escaped and made it back to their nearby village, they informed the clan's leadership, and Clan MacDonald men were sent back to the coast to settle the score. When they arrived, a small battle got underway that the MacDonalds rapidly gained control of, and in the end, nearly all 30 of the MacLeods were killed, except for one. Among the group was the first son of the chief of the MacLeods, so rather than kill him, the MacDonalds used him to send a message. They attacked him and broke each of his limbs before tying him to a small boat without oars and setting him adrift. What happened to him after that wasn't much of a concern for the MacDonalds. He was either going to die at sea or wash up somewhere and die on land. Somehow though, the son survived and the boat he was bound to drifted all the way back to the island of Skye. Upon learning what happened to his son, the elder MacLeod became furious and blind with rage. Soon an entire fleet of Clan MacLeod ships were heading toward Eig's southern coast through the rough waters of the Inner Hebrides. And as they approached Eig, a Clan MacDonald watchman spotted the fleet and informed the chief. In the watchman's estimation, Clan MacDonald was greatly outnumbered, so word was spread throughout the entire island to flee to a secluded cave where the entire population could hide. This cave is known as the Cave of Francis, but it would soon earn a new name. The entrance was little more than a narrow opening behind a waterfall with a long, tight corridor that led to a main interior room that's about 60 meters long and about 6 meters wide. As Eig's inhabitants piled in, they became more and more crammed together, but they managed to fit about 395 men, women, and children inside the cave. When Clan MacLeod landed on the south coast of the island and disembarked their ships, they were confused by where everyone was. They were expecting a fierce battle from the moment they were spotted, but it was like Clan MacDonald had virtually disappeared. Soon after landing, they spotted an elderly woman in one of the villages who was too frail to head to the cave, and they spoke to her, but she insisted she didn't know where anyone went. The MacLeods would end up sparing her life and letting her go as they resumed their search. For 3 full days afterward, the MacLeods wandered Eig in search of the MacDonalds, and after growing more and more frustrated by their fruitless efforts, they decided on the next best thing. They then set fire to all the homes on the island before returning to their ships and setting a course back to Skye. However, as the MacLeods sailed along the coast on their return trip, the MacDonalds made a terrible mistake. The clan sent a scout out of the cave to see if the coast was clear, but the man was seen by the departing MacLeods, who quickly turned their ships around toward land. Earlier that day as well, it had also begun to snow over Eig, and as the lookout raced back to the Cave of Francis, he left footprints that the MacLeods followed all the way to the entrance. Once they arrived, it became abundantly clear where everyone was. At this point, the MacLeods had a number of choices because the MacDonalds were completely trapped. The way into the cave was the way out, so the MacLeods could take their time in whatever revenge they could come up with, and what they decided on was absolutely horrifying. First, they were to divert the waterfall away from the cave entrance so they'd have a clear and dry place to perform the next phase of their plan. Once the waterfall was running away from the cave entrance, the MacLeods started grabbing dry wood, grasses, and other kindling and crammed the narrow opening with them. When this task was complete, the chief paused for a moment. He had the MacDonalds right where he wanted them, but he wondered what God's will was for the clan trapped inside the cave. As he considered this, he came up with an idea. If the next wind blew inland from the sea, he would go forward with this plan. If the wind blew out to the sea, the MacLeods would leave the island without doing them any more harm. Then, moments later, his hair and beard began to billow from the wind blowing in from the sea. To him, this was an approval straight from God. The chief then simply nodded his head, and his men immediately started setting all the brushwood and grasses clogging the entrance of the cave on fire. Prior to this, the pile of wood and grass had become damp from the mist of the waterfall despite its diversion, but this would only serve the chief's purpose further. Rather than turning into an intense blaze, the fire just smoldered and made tons of smoke that instantly began drifting down the narrow opening corridor toward the chamber where the MacLeods were hiding out. And so soon after starting the fire, the coughs and hacks of those inside could be heard by the MacLeods. The MacLeods then waited outside the cave until the fire burned itself out, and once it did, they went inside, prepared to finish the job the smoke started. But they were only met with the sight of almost 400 people stacked on top of each other. In a matter of moments, nearly an entire island's population had been wiped out. This act of vengeance only deepened the hatred between the MacDonalds and MacLeods, and while no immediate retaliation for it is known, the two clans continue to feud for generations. With all of this said, however, as with any story that comes from so long ago, the question has to be asked: is this story true, or is it just some legend passed on through the generations? For centuries, archaeologists have worked to uncover this answer. Although the story itself is detailed and writings from the period about it have been recovered, there isn't much physical evidence that backs it up. In 1743, 1841, and 1845, there are accounts of visitors to the cave finding the charred bones of adults and children inside. Sir Walter Scott, a well-known Scottish novelist and poet, is also said to have sparked a raid on the remains when he took a skull from the cave back to his home in Abbotsford. Apparently, once word got out about his find, a curious public rushed to the cave to grab any remains they could find as souvenirs. So in more recent decades, it's thought that one of two things was true. Either the event really did happen and hundreds of years of pillaging remains from inside have left the cave largely devoid of evidence, or it never actually happened, which would explain the absence of remains. However, all of this would change in October of 2016 when tourists to the Cave of Francis stumbled upon an old set of remains. Archaeologists then traveled to the site and began the careful process of recovering the bones, finding 53 in total. Initial analysis of the remains had archaeologists in agreement that the bones belonged to one 16-year-old individual, but then further tests were done, including the all-important task of radiocarbon dating them. The remains from the Cave of Francis were then determined to have been from between the years 1430 and 1630, putting them within the neighborhood of the 1577 attack. And maybe even more interesting is that further analysis determined that the 53 bones recovered belonged to 3 individuals, 2 children around the age of 9 or 10 and 1 adult. This 2016 recovery of the remains and the results of the test are the first significant modern-day evidence that the story could have some merit. Questions obviously still remain, however, as it's possible the remains ended up in the cave for some other reason. So, the Cave of Francis is still open to the public today, but it's become more commonly known by its other name, which is Scotland's Massacre Cave. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. In case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. And if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.